Y'all may be young, but y'all definitely Baptist. You got that back row covered.
Still keep it up.
All right, y'all go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 5 this morning. So today we're continuing our series, walking through the Sermon on the Mount. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about the issues related to sex and marriage. And so we're going to spend the next 2 weeks talking about marriage, and then we're going to spend some time on divorce next week, because this is what this passage talks about, okay? But let's begin with this question and just kind of get your ideas. What is the purpose of marriage? Like, what's the whole point? Or what are some of the points?
It's supposed to represent the relationship between Jesus and the church.
Man, when they answer that question the right way the first time, it just ends the discussion, Brianna. You just got the gold star, and we just have to move on now. Yes, that's absolutely right. And we're going to get there eventually and talk about that. What are some of the? Okay, let me ask you this: what are some of the reasons people get married? Like, why are some of the reasons? Maybe not you, people you know. What are some of the reasons they get married? There are no wrong answers here.
Children.
Okay, so either to have children or sometimes because they've had children. Yeah, absolutely.
My wife's nudging my elbow, so I guess she's got something.
Oh, I don't have any.
She wants you to say something.
People get married for money.
Okay, yeah.
They were married for money.
Money or security, something like that. So is that why you got married, Dalton?
I'm a teacher.
I often wonder why Crystal married me, but I know for sure it was not for that. So. Anybody else? So we can think of lots of different reasons, from kids to family stability to, sometimes we need marriage just for the culture to survive in many ways. And pleasure, because, there are things that are great about marriage. So, but there is one main purpose for marriage, and that's what Brianna talked about. God has designed it to be a demonstration of the gospel, His relationship with the church. And so when Christians talk about marriage, it is about more than simply romance and having kids, and though it certainly should include both of those. But it's talking about more than that. And so the Bible draws a view of marriage for us, and we need to make very clear that that we understand that biblical view of marriage, and that we're trying to live out that biblical view of marriage. Because there's a lot of talk about marriage these days. There's a lot of talk about what marriage should look like or shouldn't look like, or who can get married and who should get married, and we dealt with some of that last week. But we need to be clear about what biblical marriage is. Now, when I say biblical marriage, I want to be clear. I don't mean that all the marriages in the Bible are ones that we should emulate. There are really bad marriages in the Bible. There is adultery in the Bible. There is polygamy in the Bible. There's lots of divorce in the Bible. And so just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean it's something we should follow the example of. But when the Bible talks about what marriage should look like, it paints this consistent picture. God consistently proclaims from Genesis all the way to Revelation what marriage is supposed to look like. And so as we look at that today in the Sermon on the Mount, we're going to kind of we want to have an idea of what God's idea of marriage is. So let's start just by reading this. It's only 2 verses that Jesus says here about marriage and divorce in the Sermon on the Mount. But let's read them, and then we're going to dig in on not just this, but kind of everything that goes around that. So somebody read verses 31 and 32 of Matthew chapter 5 for me.
It was also said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a written notice of divorce. But I tell you, everyone who divorces his wife, except in a case of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery.
Okay, so let's start here this morning, and then let's kind of dig in depth about the background behind this, and so we can really understand what Jesus is pointing to in the Christian view of marriage. I want you to notice, first of all, what Jesus says about divorce. This is, again, one of those 6 antitheses that we see in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, I know you've heard this, but I tell you this, I say this. So it's his way of explaining this. First of all, to understand, we need to understand what divorce was like in biblical days to kind of understand what Jesus is saying here. There were basically two schools of Jewish thought at the time about marriage and divorce, and they kind of mirror what Jesus says here. So this "you have heard" statement that Jesus says here goes back to Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 1. Moses allows for divorce. He says, if a man finds some indecency in her, he should write a certificate of divorce. Okay? Now, important to understand that this was a major moral step forward for the ancient world. Before that time, most societies allowed a man to divorce his wife simply by saying, "I'm divorcing you," and that was it. Okay, and so to have a certificate of divorce was a major step forward. It allowed protection for the woman. She could then go and say, "I'm no longer bound to my previous husband," and she could get remarried instead of just saying, "Hey, I'm really not married," despite what everybody else has been saying. And so this. Before then, if a man just said, I'm done with you," and kicked her out, she had no way of taking care of herself. She had no way of getting married again. If they had kids, she had no way of taking care of the kids. She probably couldn't find any work. So it was a horrible situation for a woman. But what we see in that Old Testament, in those Old Testament commands, they're not really commands, they are allowances. And Jesus says, in Mark, he said he did this because your hearts were hard, okay? Because of hard hearts. God recognized this hardness of man's hearts, and he provides this protection for women involved here, okay? And so, we notice in here, now here's the two schools of thought in Jewish thought at that time. It was over this issue of what some indecency is. If you go to Deuteronomy chapter 24, it says if a man finds some indecency in his wife. There's one school of thought that said that pretty much covered everything. She burned your dinner, you can divorce her, okay? And then there's a second school of thought that said it could only happen in the most serious cases, adultery and something like that. And so in essence, what Jesus is doing in this passage right here when he says this is he's siding with the people who took marriage and divorce very, very seriously, as opposed to those who said if she burns your dinner, you can divorce her. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot more about divorce next week, and I know that sounds like great fun. But before we do that, I want us to understand the main point that Jesus is making here. Okay. His main point is not so you can know when you can get a divorce, all right? That's not what he wants us to do. What do you think his main point here is as he says this right here?
Main point is just don't get a divorce.
Yeah, his main point is stay married. He wants us to recognize the permanence of the marriage, of what marriage was meant to be from the very beginning. Okay, now I'm not beating up anybody who's been through a divorce, or maybe your parents have been through a divorce or something like that. We're not beating up anybody like that. What I'm saying is, if you are married now, or if you intend to get married, you need to understand that God intends for that marriage to be a marriage for life, okay? And so what I want us to all do this morning is ask ourselves if we have a proper view of what marriage is supposed to be. Most everybody in here this morning is married, not everybody, but if you are married, you need to think, okay, am I living out what God intends me for marriage? If you're not married, probably think that one day you will be. And so you need to start thinking now, what is my marriage supposed to look like? What kind of person am I supposed to be looking for in a marriage? And when we do get married, how are we supposed to live that out? What is that supposed to look like, okay? So probably those of you who are married, none of you have been married has anybody been married more than 10 years in here? More than 5? Okay, all right. Okay, I mean, Crystal and I have been married 20, but we're almost. Yeah, almost. I'm rounding off. We're getting there. I'm rounding off. So anyway, so what I want us to do this morning is have that idea, have that understanding of what God intends for Christian marriage. And if we're going to do that, we're really going to have to look at some of the background for how God has created marriage. And there's a great passage in Ephesians chapter 5 that helps us do that. And so I want to turn over there and I want us to read that and understand that. And what Ephesians chapter 5 does, though, is it takes us back even further. It takes us back to the Garden of Eden. when God created marriage in the first place. And so what we find is in Ephesians 5 is it is fleshing out both what has happened in the Old Testament when it comes to marriage and what Jesus says about marriage. It fleshes it out even further, okay? So will someone read verses 21 through 32 of Ephesians 5 for me?
What verses?
21 through 32.
Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. Where did you say read to?
32.
32. His body of which he is the Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or in any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church.
Okay, so we see three things in this passage, okay? We see what God intends for wives, we see what God intends for husbands, and at the end we see what God intends for marriage, all right? So those are the three pictures that we see in here. And so I want to walk through each of those, and it begins with a nasty little word, if you go back to verse 21, that no wife likes to hear, okay? But I want you to notice what it says, first of all, if you go back to 21. But what's the bad word in verse 22? Submit. Okay. When you hear that word submission, what's the impression you get from it?
Like to do whatever they say.
Yeah. I mean, it gives that impression, right? Do whatever they say. And so he says, wives, submit to your own husbands. And so if your idea of submission is, do whatever he says, that doesn't sound good, right? That doesn't sound good at all. But I want you to go back to verse 21. What does he say in verse 21?
To each other.
Submitting, he says, submitting to one another. And so if you go back in chapter 5, you see all these human institutions he's talking about, and then he ends that by saying submitting to one another. And so it's not just husbands and wives he's talking about right there. He's talking about in all the different God-ordained institutions, we ought to be submitting to one another. And so that gives us a different idea of what submission is supposed to look like, okay? So when we talk about submission, the first thing we have to understand is it's not just straight obedience. It's this idea that I'm going to look out for the other person's interest more than I'm looking out for my own interests. Okay? It's the idea that I'm going to seek their good rather than my own good. And that's just what Jesus said, right? Love your neighbor as you love yourself. But then in verse 22, he gets to this kind of specific way that wives are supposed to submit to their husbands. And he says there's a reason that wives are supposed to do that in verse 23. And what is that?
The husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church.
Yeah. So he says the husband is the head of the wife. So if submission is a dirty word, head is also a dirty word in this. When you hear that, the husband is the head of the wife, what do you think he means by that? Now, husband's afraid to say anything.
Well, it's just like, the husband's the head of the wife, the priest is the head of the church, Christ is the head of the church. Ultimately, you can read it as it's a huge responsibility.
Yeah,
if you're getting likened to Christ being the head of the church, then ultimately I'm responsible for her well-being, her spiritual well-being, physical well-being, like where we go as a family. There's a lot of responsibility on that.
Yeah, and that's what he's getting at here, okay? And I want you to hang on to that idea because I really want to dive in more on that in just a moment. What we see here in this passage is that the responsibility for the husband is huge in this, okay? But so in this sense, what do you think he means by submit then? What is the wife's job when it comes to this? Well, let me ask you this. Does it mean that as wives, you have to do exactly what your husband says as soon as your husband says it, without asking any questions, and thank him when you're done?
No.
Okay. Everybody's like, I hope not. Well, what does it mean then? What do you think what does this look like in marriage? What does this kind of submission look like?
I'll just, like, for us as an example, like, we always talk about everything before we do it, and he hears me out, I hear him out, and we come to an agreement together. And ultimately, if he has a different idea or opinion about something, then if I don't necessarily agree with it, I submit to it, even if it's not exactly 100% my way or what I want to do. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
It's been a very happy 6 years. No, but I mean, it doesn't, so that is easy for a wife, I believe, if the husband is following the Lord. If he's not following the Lord, it's not gonna happen, you know?
But does this say submit if your husband's following the Lord?
It doesn't, but.
Yeah. But it certainly makes it easier, right? But this is the way it should work in a Christian marriage, okay? Submission is not just husband comes and makes pronouncements and wife says, thank you very much. It is. It's this back and forth. Remember, we go back to the Garden of Eden. Think about what happened back in the Garden of Eden. Adam is created, and what's the job that God gave Adam before Eve ever came along? Do y'all remember?
Name all the animals.
He named all the animals. So no telling how long it took him to name all these animals. You know, frog, horse, cow, dog, you know, spider. I mean, he's just coming up with names one after another here, you know. And what did he notice as he begins to name all these animals? There were none like him, and all of them had what?
Companion.
They all none of them were a good companion for him, but they all had companions for themselves. They all were male and female. And so if you'll remember, as you go back into the creation story, at the end of each day, what did God say? He saw what he'd done, and what?
It was good.
It was good. And at the end of this, God says, what? Do y'all remember?
It's not good for man to be
It's
alone.
not good for man to be alone. So this is the first pronouncement that God makes of something that he has created not being good. And he knew that. He needed Adam to see that. Okay? And so as Adam names all the animals, he recognizes that this is not a good situation I'm in. I need something better. I need more than just relationship with God. I need relationship with someone else. And so God creates woman, and he looks at Eve and he goes, whoa, man. And there she gets her name, okay? And so we see from the very, and that's where the first marriage comes from. But remember what God said. God said, I will give him someone who will do what? Y'all remember the word? Help him, okay? Now, when we think of the word help, sometimes we think of it as like a teacher's aid or something like that. Nothing wrong with teacher's aids, but what does a teacher's aid do, Brittany?
Just help with the teacher needs.
And
Does whatever the teacher
does what the teacher tells them to do, right? So that's true. But what a teacher also helps a student. And what does a teacher help? Does a teacher helping a student do what the student says? There are different kinds of help is the point, okay? So a teacher's aide does what the teacher says, but a student also needs help. They do what the teacher says too, okay? So helping, I don't want you to get this idea that helping is just like, hey, will you hold this, will you hold this screwdriver for me? It's not that kind of help that he's talking about when he talks about a wife being a helper to a husband. It's talking about coming alongside, being a partner, he said man and woman were both made in the image of God. And so having this sense of equality in their creation, and she's come along to help him do what he was commanded to do, coming alongside, okay? And so if you don't see your wife as an advisor, as someone who is there to help you get to where God wants you both to go, and not just as someone who does what they're told, then you're missing out on the full view of what marriage is. The intention of marriage is for husband and wife to work together to accomplish the purposes that God has for them. But God has created marriage in such a way that the husband is the leader in that. Okay, and so that's what he's getting to here. Okay, so we see what's a relatively short paragraph about what God's intention for wives is, and then we see a really long paragraph about what God's intention for husbands is, and that goes back to what you were talking about here. Okay, so verse 25, what are husbands told to do? Love your wives, and then go even further. How are husbands to love their wives?
As Christ loved the church.
As Christ loved the church. What does that mean? What did Christ do for the church? He died for the church, yeah. So what do you think Paul's point is here when he's talking about how the way that husbands should love their wives?
You basically giving up your whole self for it.
Yeah, that's what he's calling us to do. Give up your lives for your wife, to serve, to sacrifice, to do whatever's necessary. And notice what he begins to talk about in verses 26 and 27. He's saying that Christ gave up, Christ died for the church so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself without splendor or spot or wrinkle or any such thing, so that she might be holy and without blemish. So he's saying the reason Jesus died for the church was so that he could make them righteous, so that he could present them to God in their perfection. So what does that tell us about the man's job in the marriage? What kind of leader are they to be? Well, let me put it this way. Are they just supposed to say, we're going to spend this much on this bill, and we're going to do this, and we're going to buy this house, and we're going to have this job? Really, what is he talking about right here? What kind of leadership is he talking about?
Just a real, like a deep love and a seeking of holiness and like a relationship.
Yeah.
For her and for each other together.
Husbands, potential husbands, it is your job to spiritually lead your families. All those other ways of leadership are important, but the most important thing you can do as a husband is lead your families to Jesus. It's the most important thing, okay? I'm not good with the bills. I thought when we first got married that I had to be the guy, the budget guy. Crystal called me the budget Nazi, okay? and that took us down a road of almost financial ruin because I couldn't keep it together. Like she majored in accounting before she went into dietetics. I'm like, why am I trying to do the bills when she actually knows how to do this kind of stuff, And so she handles the bills now. But I'm the spiritual leader of the household. And so you find ways in which you work these things out among yourselves, but ultimately what he's saying here is that husbands, you are called to spiritually lead your families, and specifically your wives. So what are some of the ways that ought to practically work itself out? What does that look like, do you think? What should husbands be doing?
Bless you.
Y'all are real quiet this morning.
I just don't want to talk all the time.
What do y'all think? What are some simple things that husbands ought to be doing to lead their families and their wives spiritually?
Making sure they get to church.
Going to church. It's a really simple thing, isn't it? Do y'all know how many married women will be in church today without their husbands? Do y'all know how many married men will be in church without their wives? A lot less, okay? And that's not just this church, that's every church, okay? So men are falling down on this simple part of it pretty poorly, okay? And I'm not beating y'all up. Y'all are all in Sunday school today, so y'all are doing good, okay? But we need husbands who will lead their wives simply by taking them to church. What are some other things?
Seeking God.
Yeah, just seeking God.
Seeking Him, and she sees that, then it's gonna help her.
Yeah, just seeking the Lord in their own lives, absolutely. Trying to grow in Christ yourself. Praying with your family, praying with your wife. I mean, these are simple things, but they have a profound impact on the marriage. I'm not saying they're going to make everything great, okay? Every day is not going to be, every day is not going to be your best day ever. Because we're humans and we mess up a lot, okay? And if I allowed Crystal to give a testimony today, which I don't think it's a good idea on this day, she could have some things to say about me that probably wouldn't be pretty in ways that I've failed miserably in this over the years. But this is the goal. This is what husbands should be doing. They ought to be seeking to lead their family spiritually, okay? And so what I want you to see is when a husband does that, just like Josh said, man, how many wives are not going to want to submit to that, are not going to want to follow that leadership? But let me say this, because we're all sinners, husbands and wives are both going to be tempted to go against these God-ordained roles at all times. Husbands, you're going to be tempted to either dominate your wife or be so passive that you don't do anything. I mean, all husbands you're going to be tempted to sit on the couch all the time, or you're going to be tempted to be the boss who is telling everybody what to do. We're going to be tempted to those two things. And wives, you're going to be tempted to dominate your husbands. You're going to be tempted to want to be the bosses in your household and want to be the leaders in your household. And that's just because we're all sinners. We're going to be tempted to do the opposite of what we're supposed to do, okay? And but when we do this right, and listen, it'll be something you'll be working on the rest of your marriage, but when we do this right, this little intricate spiritual dance, this is how marriage works the way it's supposed to. And this is how we get, as we go back to Matthew chapter 5, we find ourselves in that place where divorce is never even something that's considered. It's not even something we'd even think about, because we're both pursuing Christ together. The husband's leading, the wife is helping, and everything is working just exactly the way it's supposed to, okay? Again, we're still sinners, so we're going to mess up a lot, but it's going to work the way it's supposed to, all right? Now, so I know we said we have a paragraph about what wives should do. We have a paragraph about what husbands should do. Now I want you to see what Paul says about what marriage is really about. So after he talks about the role of the husband, beginning in verse 28, he begins to explain what the purpose of marriage is. Really in 31 is where he really digs in. He quotes Genesis when God created Adam and Eve, and he has the first marriage ceremony. He says something that I'm sure you've heard 1,000 times when it comes to marriage. And what does he say in verse 31?
Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to.
And they should be what? One flesh. Okay? And then in verse 32, he explains what his point is in this. So he says, you remember back in Genesis, this is how God created marriage. Now I need you to understand what the point was from the beginning. So this is a mystery that has only now been revealed. God created marriage with this particular purpose, and what does he say in verse 32 about this mystery?
Refers to Christ in the church.
It refers to Christ in the church. This is why Brianna gets the gold star today, okay? Because what Paul is saying is that the reason that God created marriage in the first place, all those thousands of years ago back in the Garden of Eden, and the reason he calls husbands to lead and wives to help and submit, the reason he does that is because when we do that the way we're supposed to, then it becomes this beautiful reflection of the relationship between Jesus and his church, okay? As Jesus as the head of the church, and then the church following the leadership of Jesus, okay? And so he's saying that's the whole point. Back in the Garden of Eden, when I walked all those animals past Adam and showed that he didn't have a good companion, he didn't know what was going on. Moses probably didn't fully understand what was going on when he wrote it down. But what I was doing at that point was creating this relationship that was going to be passed down through the centuries, that was ultimately going to point to the relationship between Jesus and his church. Now, I need to say something. I do premarital counseling, and I tell couples this every time. This means that we have to show each other grace. Husbands, you have to show your wife grace because you are the Jesus in the relationship. Wives, you have to show your husband grace because he ain't Jesus. Okay? And so we're constantly having to show one another grace in this. But when we do this, it is this beautiful reflection of the gospel that points people to Jesus. When people see, okay, they're Christians and their marriage looks different than ours and it seems to be working in a way that ours isn't working, you can say, yeah, it's working because we're doing it the way God intended it to be, by the power of the Holy Spirit. That's his whole purpose in creating marriage in the first place. And so as we go back and take all this, we just pack all this up and we take it back to Matthew chapter 5 with us now and see what Jesus is saying about why the idea of divorce is such a serious thing. When husbands and wives don't live this out the way they're supposed to, what are they doing?
Basically abandoning the church. It'd be like Christ abandoning the church.
Yeah, that's exactly it. When you don't live this out the way you're supposed to do, when you break up a marriage for and we'll look at some of the specific reasons next week, for reasons that God never intended it to be broken up for, when you do that, you are telling the world lies about God. That's ultimately what he's saying here, okay? And that's why this is so serious. And that's why, if you are married, you must take this vow as the most serious vow you've ever made, okay? Yes, God provides some exceptions when marriage just can't be saved, but that is always the exception. It's never the rule, okay? And so what he's saying is we must keep our marriages intact so we can be the witness to the world that we're supposed to be. You know, even when a husband or a wife, when a marriage isn't going great, and either the husband or the wife or both of them do things they shouldn't do, and they could get divorced, but they don't, it says something powerful about Jesus. You know, because Jesus got plenty of reason to abandon me. He's got, I joke, he's got plenty of reason to abandon me every time I pull onto North Hill Street. You know, and so, but he doesn't give up. And so when we as husbands and wives don't give up on our marriages, even when things get hard, then we're doing the same thing here. You know, we're not giving up. When you don't give up on Jesus, even when things get hard, when Jesus doesn't give up on you, even when things get hard, and it's the same thing with our marriage, we can reflect that relationship that Jesus has with the church. And that's why it's so important that we keep our marriages together. There's lots of other good reasons to keep your marriages together, but this is the ultimate reason, okay? This is the ultimate reason that we stay and we keep pushing and we keep living this out the way we're supposed to. But let me tell you guys, if you'll live it out this way, and this is the path to like profound happiness when both husband and wife are working through this. Now, we're all sinners and we're never gonna do this perfectly, and probably more what this is gonna look like is you're gonna get moments and pockets of this profound happiness rather than sustained joy all the time, because, you know, you're like, oh, things are going so great, and then, you know, and then you look up and one of the kids says, you know, painted on the walls or something, and suddenly, you know, things are like that real quick, you know, or you have an argument, and you're going to have arguments, especially when we're talking about going back and forth and talking with one another. Arguments are inevitable, again, because we're sinners and because we have different personalities. But what he's calling us to is over a lifetime. This is where we can find our greatest joy. Now, God also talks about singleness as a gift, and so maybe not everyone is supposed to get married, but whether you are married now or are going to get married in the future, or God has intended you to be single, God can still use this stuff for your good. And so if you plan to get married in the future, you need to be thinking about this now. How am I going to live this out when I get married? Who am I looking for now that can do this with me? Instead of the reasons we normally think about when we get married, you know, like, you look pretty good to me, you know, or things like that. We need to be really thinking through and thinking about these kinds of things. And if you are married and you're not living this out right now, this is a call to go after Jesus and make your marriage what God intended it to be. Okay? All right. Anybody want to add anything to any of this?
I'm open and confident enough to share, like, this is my second marriage. So I've been married one time before, a very short marriage, a lot of head knowledge going in, wanting to do the right thing, wanting to line up with the word, not a whole lot of heart knowledge. And I'll say the biggest difference, and we're going on 6 years and completely different experience, very happy marriage, a lot of sacrificing for each other, is the second time around, and kudos to her on her first time around. She was married to the Lord in what this verse said more than she was me. She was in love with this more than me. So whenever she was, early on in the marriage, as far as submission and stuff goes, and it is a strong word, but there was insecurities that carried over from my first time around into the second one. And so you want to line up, but experiences throw roadblocks up sometimes, and just she come into the marriage with, and not a whole lot of example from her mother, but from some of the women in her church in Texas, a lot of good godly examples. She came into the marriage actually leading because she was more in line with this, and stayed that way through me getting over some of my issues, which kind of led me back to, okay, it's okay to let this guard down. It's okay to line up here and do what I need to do because she's going to be solid. So the verses can read differently, but it's an equal share. And, just because it says for the husband to lead doesn't mean he's always going to be the one to lead. Sometimes it's the other one. But if you are married to this and married to what Christ is calling you to do in each lane and for each part, it does a whole lot like you were talking about, that true joy.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. And you make another really good point. All of us come into marriage with a lot of baggage, no matter what. We have experiences. We have people that we watched before us that maybe didn't do it really well. We have expectations about maybe how our parents did it well or didn't do it well, what worked for them. And man, the main thing is you're following this. Like, who folds the laundry is not as important, though somebody needs to fold the laundry, and both of you probably need to, and I know I need to fold more. So but you got to work that. You work that stuff out in the boundaries of what we see here in Ephesians chapter 5. Okay. All right. Anybody want to add anything else? All right, let's close in prayer. Rob, you want to close this?
Dear Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for the lesson, Lord. Thank you for ways preparation. And Lord, I just pray that we can take what we've talked about this morning and apply it to our lives, Lord. Thank you for this class. Thank you for everybody in it. I just pray as we go into the service, Lord, you open up our hearts and minds, Lord, and just be with us this week and bring us back safely next week. In your name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. All right, do we have announcements to show know of today?
But yeah, we had a class outing, 14th.
14th, so
People were
that's-
going, we didn't know. It says by today, but I feel like we can